The consequences of a victory. This story begins in the midst of the interwar period. In the Soviet Union, Lenin has just died, leaving a huge state behind him and a testament. On February 1924, Lenin's testament reaches the Communist Party's leadership and the Central Committee, showing what Lenin wanted for the future of the empire. Later in May, at the 13th Party Congress, Lenin's testament was discussed. It was shared with all the delegates regardless of Stalin trying to suppress it. Right after these events, the testament quickly reached the public eye by being leaked not only by Trotsky but also Krupskaya and many other opposers of Stalin, as he was on the way to becoming the next leader of the Soviet Union. But instead, following the wishes from Lenin's testament, he was expelled from the position of General Secretary. After these events transpired, a new question arose. If Stalin isn't going to lead the Soviets, then who will? Candidates like Trotsky started to rise in prominence, but due to his slight unpopularity, the party has chosen Nikolai Bukharin as the next leader of the Soviet Union. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union took a different approach. He wanted to focus on strengthening what Russia was already good at, which was farming. He still allowed limited market mechanisms and private enterprise, but the very weird combination of socialism and limited market mechanism created more of a dumpster fire of an economy. Little to no new factories would be built and the state would stay in an agrarian society form. He would try to establish some form of cooperation with the West, mainly with the French, which would bolster their position worldwide. As these events transpire in the East, other wild events happen in the West. On February 15, 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was assassinated. During a speech in Florida at Bayfront Park, Giuseppe Zagara, with a small .32 caliber U.S. revolver on a wobbly chair, manages to hit the president right in the top of his head. This has left John Nance Garner as the President of the United States. During over the next 4 years, Garner would approach the New Deal less radically, as he was a moderate Southern Democrat. At the end of his term, he left the U.S. in a terrible state, barely making any recovery from the Great Depression and hindering the popularity of the Democratic Party. Events continue to transpire. Germany had a troubled yet persistent Weimar democracy, oftentimes ending up in political gridlock but still being successful in keeping out extremists out of power. The giant war reparations imposed on the people after WW2 were paid off by borrowing money from the US, which worsened and led to economic downturn when the Great Depression kicked off. Out of this madness, the movement of Adolf Hitler rose to prominence with the ideology of National Socialism, Nazism. The Nazis would promise an upheaval from this situation, utilizing propaganda to install fear in the German population, inciting hatred towards the Allies and framing the Jewish people as conspirators against the German state, blaming them for the ensuing poverty and joblessness, as many of them controlled financial institutions. The rise of both the extreme right and the far left led to complete gridlock in the Reichstag. It led to more dissolutions and paralysis because of how divided German society was at the time. In 1930, Heinrich Brüning, the Chancellor at that time, pushed the President to dismiss Parliament using Article 48 of the German Constitution. President Hindenburg finally chose Adolf Hitler as Chancellor on January 30, 1933, out of fear of a communist takeover. This gave Hitler the opportunity to establish a dictatorship and solidify Nazi authority over Germany. Out of this regime, many policies were established over the upcoming years. Anti-Semitic policies that prompted a wave of the Jewish people to escape Germany and in search of a more Jewish-lenient area, the boycott of Jewish businesses, and the Nuremberg laws, to name a few. There were also many economic and social policies established for the German people in order to try to let them benefit from. Hitler Youth aimed at indoctrinating the youth with Nazi ideals to create a future loyal population. NS Gemeinschaft Kraft durch Freud was an leisure organization, set up as a tool to promote advantages of Nazism to people not only in Germany but also internationally. Public works projects and the Autobahn and the Volkswagen project and many more were amongst Hitler's plans. But Hitler had much more radical plans than just this. No, he wanted Germany to be a global hegemony, he started rebuilding the German military in 1935 and remilitarized the Rhineland in early 1936, going against many key establishments from the Treaty of Versailles. This angered the West, but they did not want to go to war with the Germans anytime soon and went the path of appeasement. As years moved on March 12, 1938, Germany annexed Austria as a part of the Anschluss, and later that year in September, as a part of the Munich Agreement, they annexed the Sudetenland. At this point Hitler was disappointed in the fact that he wanted to be at war. He wanted to see how powerful was his army and his military strategy of blitzkrieg. Right after annexing the Sudetenland, Hitler contacted Mussolini, the leader of Italy. In that meeting he discussed with him the potential of creating a new hegemony. He shared many of his expansionist plans with him and convinced him to prepare his armies for certain operations. In the meantime, other events happened in Asia. China has aligned itself with the Japanese as Wang Jingwei consolidates power. Before he was prime minister and was a dominant figure in opposition to Chiang Kai-shek. During the kidnapping of Chiang Kai-shek, he was accidentally killed by one of the National Army soldiers, as in the darkness a soldier didn't recognize Chiang and assumed him as some citizen retaliating. Out of this madness, Wang Jingwei managed to take power and aligning China with the Japanese. Although he did not give up China and turn it into a Japanese puppet as it still remained fully independent, he did use Japanese help to industrialize and try reconcile China. This caused a change in plans in the Japanese high command, as now they would prioritize their other threats. Japan continues to pressure the Chinese government and continue their approach of simply seizing Chinese lands and further integrating them. Japan would now start selling and establishing many harbors, naval dockyards and bases, while sharing their technological advancement with them too. Japan would also receive Chinese oil reserves and many other resources they may find useful in the future. Back in North America, Robert A. Taft has won the 1936 election, winning with Earl Smith, who tried to run for president in 1928 but lost the election with Herbert Hoover. Later lost the nominee to Roosevelt and managed to get nominated in 1936. He still lost after a fair fight with Taft, owing to the fact that a large populace lost faith in the Democratic Party on account of their failure in addressing the Great Depression, and the public would see Taft more favorably and would want to see his idea come to fruition. Taft's policies wouldn't be very successful for the first year, but in the second quarter many business started to flourish, mainly thanks to the many tax cuts for business and the very positive approach to businesses. This allowed business to afford more employees and, in general, allowed them to pay them more. By the end of his second year, the economy has recovered to a much better state, and by the end of his first term, has almost returned to its previous pre-economic boom state. Taft has also changed the approach of neutrality. In 1937 he passed the Neutrality Act, an act that would prevent the U.S. from engaging in any conflict for a very long time. Taft, in opposition to his progressive opponents, have decided to not place any sanctions on aggressive nations that started to rapidly expand. Despite the events that would transpire in the past year in Europe, Taft would win re-election, winning with Henry A. Wallace. In the meantime, the Spanish Civil War happened starting in 1936. On top came out the nationalist leader Francisco Franco, a staunch nationalist trying to prevent the rise of communism in Spain. Italy invaded Ethiopia, seeking to bring back a form of glory for Italy. In addition to these events, as the Nazis discover nuclear fission, Nazi scientists at the time convince Hitler and the Nazi Party that nuclear science is not Jewish science but a great weapon they can create to wreak devastation and conquer the world with. The arguments presented by these scientists convinced the party to grant them a larger amount of funding than they wanted to at the beginning. Out of what seems to be nowhere, Hitler with Mussolini has decided to activate their plans, invading Poland over the region of Danzig. Britain and France joined beside Poland into this fight as Poland's independence was guaranteed by the Allies. And so a great war has begun. On November 1 Germany entered Poland and within 40 days occupied the entire country, both western parts and the eastern. After this success, the Germans set sights on their next target. They activated Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Norway, in order to secure iron ore imports. After that, the Nazis set a new goal: blitz through France. They invaded France by bypassing the Maginot Line by invading the Benelux countries. They managed to conquer all of France and the Benelux within 6 weeks. A large evacuation of soldiers also happened at Dunkirk, which was a somewhat relieving moment for the Allied powers. But unfortunately, France has capitulated, and the Nazis and the Italians would set their next sights at North Africa. In order to cut out the British from the Mediterranean, the Nazis, instead of engaging a proposed massive costly battle over Britain, they would set their sights at Gibraltar and activate Operation Felix, which was an operation proposed by Hermann Göring and Heinz Guderian. They would demand submission from the Spanish in return for control over Gibraltar. At the beginning, in search of not engaging in a conflict, as Franco's country is just recovering from the Civil War and the want to avoid another conflict at all costs. After the refusal, Hitler sent out his armies into Spain. Activating Operation Felix, he would focus on capturing the middle of Spain and reaching Gibraltar as fast as possible. But as Franco sees the Nazis enter the country, and knowing his army is in a bad shape right after the Civil War, and although most of them are veterans, they still were weak and tired, Franco prefers to cooperate with the Germans at this point, and he orders his men to stand down, and he officially negotiated with Hitler. Once his armies reached Madrid. Soon after this order, he quickly went to meet Hitler and discuss his surrender, or more of a deal to switch sides. Within 3 days, Spain fully surrendered and Gibraltar was sieged and occupied by August 8, as in order to prevent reinforcements, the Italians tried to blockade Gibraltar from the seas and the Gibraltar Strait. The Germans quickly and swiftly managed to overrun the British garrison in Iberia, blocking of one path out of the Mediterranean. Next, the Germans would set their sights on assisting the Italians in their conquest of the Suez Canal. The Italians, although somewhat successful as they push into Egypt, using their great numbers advantage. They also further funneled in even more troops. After the Germans joined in with Rommel, they quickly overrun the British garrisons, conquered Cairo on the 13th of August. By August 20th, the Nazis and the Italians have successfully occupied the Suez, stabilizing their position in the Mediterranean. From there, some German regiments would return and prepare for the next operation, while a small amount would stay in North Africa to assist the Italians in pushing further down south into Sudan and east into Jerusalem. Returning to the Asian front. The Japanese have coordinated with the Tripartite Pact, which was a pact that set the spheres of influence between Japan and the rest of the Axis. According to this pact, Germany and Italy would dominate Europe and Africa, while Japan focuses on Asia and the Pacific. The Japanese, in order to distract the British and to take hold of the vast resources in the area, mainly oil, would attack Malaysia and the Dutch East Indies. At this time, they had a planned operation for December 8, 1940, to attack Pearl Harbor and bomb dockyard, ships and oil reserves. It was proposed by Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka, but they do not follow his plans, as the military and the admiral that was set to launch this attack disapproved this attack. Even the emperor disapproved these plans, as Hirohito himself was somewhat a pacifist and saw the great risks of this attack. This plan was not activated due to its risks, as Japan did not see the United States as a threat for now, as Taft's isolationism was very strict and he did not anger or place any specific towards them tariffs nor sanctions. They knew that the US would not engage without an actual attack, and it was after the 1940 election Taft won again, which meant the continuation of the status quo. Japan also demands French Indochina from its occupier Vichy France, which after some talks agrees to the terms and cedes the territory over to Japan. The invasions of Malaya and Dutch Indies move smoothly and are completed within 3 months. The plans for Pearl Harbor were fully cancelled by now, but instead on December 8, Japan invited Siam to join their East Asian co-prosperity sphere.